The trail up Mount Blackwood was supposed to be a simple day hike. Sarah had done it dozens of times before, but something felt different as she climbed through the morning mist. The familiar sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. She'd started early to beat the crowds, her boots crunching softly on the frost-covered leaves. The trail wound through dense pine forest for the first mile, then opened onto rocky switchbacks that led to the summit. Sarah knew every twist and turn, every landmark tree and boulder. That's why she noticed immediately when things began to change. First, it was the silence. The usual chorus of birds and rustling wildlife had ceased entirely. Even her own footsteps seemed to echo strangely, as if the sound was being thrown back at her from impossible angles. She paused and called out hello. Just to break the oppressive quiet. Hello. Came the response, crystal clear and immediate. Sarah smiled, remembering the echo point about halfway up the trail. Sound bounced beautifully off the rock face there. But as she continued hiking, she realized she was nowhere near that spot yet. The trail stretched ahead through forest, with no cliff face in sight. She shrugged and kept walking, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the morning sun barely penetrated. Every few minutes, she'd catch a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. An hour into the hike, Sarah decided to test the echo again. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "Testing, testing. Testing, testing." Came the immediate reply, but this time it was wrong. The voice that answered wasn't quite her own. It was similar, but deeper somehow, with an odd resonance that made her skin crawl. She stood perfectly still, straining to listen, but heard only that unnatural silence. As she continued up the trail, Sarah began to notice other oddities. Footprints in the muddy patches that matched her boots exactly, but were pointing in the wrong direction. Broken branches at shoulder height, as if someone her exact size had pushed through the same spots. Most disturbing of all, she found her own water bottle sitting on a rock ahead of her, despite the fact that hers was still clipped to her pack. The second bottle was identical in every way, same brand, same scratches, even the same faded sticker she'd applied months ago. With trembling fingers, she compared it to her own. They were perfect duplicates. She left the mysterious bottle where she'd found it and hurried on, but couldn't resist looking back. It was gone. By the time Sarah reached the halfway point, she was seriously considering turning back. But the summit was so close, and she'd never failed to complete this hike before. Pride pushed her forward, even as every instinct screamed at her to retreat. The trail grew steeper, winding between massive boulders that created natural corridors. In these narrow passages, her footsteps echoed loudly off the stone walls. But increasingly, she heard other footsteps too. They matched her pace exactly, stopping when she stopped, resuming when she moved. When she spun around to look behind her, the footsteps continued for just a moment longer than they should have, as if someone was trying to hide but couldn't quite match her timing. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice bouncing off the rocks. "Who's there?" came the reply, in that same wrong voice that was almost but not quite her own. Sarah began to run. The trail was treacherous, with loose rocks and sudden drop-offs, but terror drove her forward. Behind her, she could hear the steady rhythm of pursuit footsteps that matched hers, breathing that synchronized with her own ragged gasps, even the jingle of gear that sounded identical to her pack. She didn't stop until she burst out of the forest onto the rocky summit. The view was spectacular as always, rolling mountains stretching to the horizon, a perfect blue sky, the world spread out below like a map. For a moment, the beauty of it all made her forget her fear. Then she noticed her backpack sitting on the summit marker. Sarah looked down at her shoulders. Her pack was gone. She distinctly remembered wearing it just moments ago, felt its familiar weight during the entire climb. But there it sat, 20 feet away, positioned exactly where she always left it when taking summit photos. With growing dread, she approached the pack and unzipped it. Everything was there: her lunch, water, first aid kit, even her phone. But when she checked the photos on her phone, her blood ran cold. There were dozens of pictures of herself on this very summit, taken from angles that would have been impossible for her to shoot. Pictures of her eating lunch, pictures of her checking her map, pictures of her looking directly at the camera with an expression of pure terror she'd never made. The timestamp on the photos showed they'd been taken in the future 3 hours from now. Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through the images. In the background of several photos, she could see a figure that looked exactly like her, standing at the edge of the summit. But the figure's face was wrong somehow, distorted in a way that made her stomach turn. As she studied the photos more closely, she realized the figure was getting closer to her in each subsequent image. A sound behind her made Sarah spin around. There, at the tree line, stood herself. Same clothes, same gear, same face, but with eyes that held an emptiness that made her soul recoil. The doppelganger smiled with Sarah's mouth and began walking forward with Sarah's gait. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" the thing said in Sarah's voice, but with inflections that were subtly, terrifyingly wrong. Sarah stumbled backward toward the edge of the summit. The drop was hundreds of feet, but the alternative seemed worse. The other Sarah kept approaching, its smile growing wider with each step. "You've been following me," Sarah gasped. "Following you?" The doppelganger laughed, and even Sarah's own laugh sounded alien coming from that mouth. "You've been following me. Check the trail register at the bottom." With dawning horror, Sarah realized what the creature meant. Every hiker signed in at the trailhead, documenting their planned route and return time. If someone checked that register now, they would find Sarah's name already there, with a timestamp from early this morning. But Sarah hadn't signed and she'd been in too much of a hurry to start her hike. The thing wearing her face was still approaching. "Don't worry," it said in her voice. "I'll take good care of your life. Your job, your apartment, your friends, they'll never know the difference. Well, they might notice I'm a little quieter than before, but people change, don't they?" Sarah's foot slipped on the loose rocks at the summit's edge. She windmilled her arms, fighting for balance, staring into the abyss below. When she looked up again, the doppelganger was gone. But from somewhere behind her, she heard her own voice calling out, "Help! Someone fell! Oh God, someone fell from the summit!" And Sarah realized, in her final moment of understanding, that the echo had never been answering back at all. It had been calling ahead. Marcus had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 6 weeks when he took the wrong turn. It was a simple mistake, a misread blaze, a moment of inattention while adjusting his pack straps. One minute he was following the familiar white markers through dense Virginia forest, the next he was on an unmarked trail that didn't appear on any of his maps. He'd hiked enough to know that panic was the enemy. The smart thing was to backtrack until he found the main trail again. But when Marcus turned around, the path behind him looked completely different from the one he'd just walked. The trees were arranged differently, the undergrowth was thicker, and most unsettling of all, there were no signs of his own passage, no disturbed leaves, no boot prints in the soft earth. The trail ahead was well maintained, almost suspiciously so. The path was clear of fallen branches and overgrowth, as if someone had recently groomed it. Wooden bridges spanned every stream, and mile markers appeared at regular intervals, though they bore no indication of which trail system they belonged to. After an hour of walking, Marcus encountered the first house. It sat just off the trail, a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. The sight filled him with relief. Locals could give him directions back to the inn. He approached the front door and knocked. Come in," called a cheerful voice from inside. "Door's open." Marcus pushed inside and found himself in a cozy living room where an elderly woman sat knitting by the fireplace. She looked up with a bright smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Oh my, another hiker!" she exclaimed. "We don't get many visitors on this trail. Most folks stick to the main paths. Sit down, dear, you look exhausted." Something about her warmth made Marcus feel instantly at ease. He dropped his pack and settled into a comfortable chair, accepting the cup of hot tea she pressed into his hands. "I'm a bit lost, actually," he admitted. "I was on the Appalachian Trail and somehow ended up here. Do you know how I can get back?" The woman's smile never wavered. "Oh, you'll find your way, dear. Everyone does, eventually. But why don't you rest here tonight? It gets dangerous hiking these woods after dark." Marcus was about to decline. He had camping gear and preferred to sleep under the stars, but exhaustion hit him like a wave. The chair was incredibly comfortable, the fire was warm, and the old woman's presence was soothing in a way he couldn't quite explain. Just for a few hours, he murmured, and before he knew it, he was fast asleep. When Marcus woke, the sun was streaming through the windows and the old woman was gone. A note on the table read, "Gone to town for supplies. Help yourself to breakfast. Follow the trail east to get back to your path." Martha. Grateful for her hospitality, Marcus ate the eggs and toast she'd left warming on the stove, shouldered his pack, and headed back to the trail. The path continued to be suspiciously well maintained, but now he noticed other details that made him uneasy. The trees all seemed to be the same species and size, as if they'd been planted rather than grown naturally. The wildlife was too quiet, no bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush, no insects buzzing. After several miles, Marcus came to another house. This one was larger, a two-story colonial with a wraparound porch. A man in his 50s sat in a rocking chair, waving as Marcus approached. "Well, hello there, hiker." The man called out. Come up. You look like you could use a cold drink." Despite his growing unease, Marcus found himself climbing the porch steps. The man introduced himself as Bill and handed Marcus a glass of lemonade that was perfectly cold and exactly the right balance of sweet and tart. "You wouldn't happen to know the way back to the Appalachian Trail?" Marcus asked. Bill chuckled. "Lots of folks ask that question. Truth is, son, there's only one trail through these parts, and you're on it. But don't you worry, it'll take you exactly where you need to go." Something in Bill's tone made Marcus's skin crawl, but the lemonade was so refreshing and the porch so comfortable that he found it hard to focus on his concerns. When Bill offered him a room for the night, Marcus accepted without really understanding why. He woke the next morning to find Bill gone and another note, "Had to leave early for work. Trail continues east. You're making good progress. Bill." As Marcus left the house, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the flower bed beside the porch, there were hiking boots planted like flowers, pairs and pairs of them, all different sizes and brands. Some looked new, others were weathered and old. All were empty. Marcus ran back to the trail and began hiking as fast as he could. But with each mile, his pack seemed to grow heavier, his legs more tired. The perfectly maintained path stretched endlessly ahead, and no matter how long he walked, the scenery never seemed to change. By afternoon, he was exhausted again. When the third house appeared, a quaint cottage with flower boxes and a picket fence, Marcus wanted to keep walking. But his legs carried him to the front door as if they had a will of their own. "Hello," called a young woman from the garden. Perfect timing. "I just made a fresh pot of coffee." Her name was Susan, and she was the friendliest person Marcus had ever met. She insisted he stay for dinner, then for the night, then for breakfast. Each time Marcus tried to express urgency about finding his way back to the main trail, Susan would smile and nod and somehow change the subject. It was only when he was leaving the next morning that Marcus realized the truth. In Susan's guest room, he'd noticed a journal on the nightstand. The pages were filled with entries from hikers, dozens and dozens of them, all describing the same experience: getting lost, finding the trail, staying in the same houses with the same impossibly kind people. The entries spanned decades. Some were dated from the 1970s, others just days old. But they all ended the same way: the trail continues east. I'm making good progress. Marcus tore out of the house and ran down the trail, but his legs felt like lead. Behind him, he could hear Susan calling, "Don't forget to sign the journal. All our guests sign the journal." As he ran, Marcus began to notice other details he'd missed before. The mile markers weren't counting up, they were counting down. The trees weren't just similar, they were identical, repeating in patterns like wallpaper. And in the distance, barely visible through the forest, he could see the outline of a fourth house. But worst of all, Marcus realized he couldn't remember what lay behind him. He could remember the three houses, the three hosts, but everything before that first wrong turn was fading like a dream. His life before the trail, his reasons for hiking, even his own last name, it was all slipping away. The fourth house was a grand Victorian mansion with a wraparound porch and ornate gingerbread trim. On the porch sat a familiar figure, an elderly woman knitting by a rocking chair. She looked up with a bright smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Oh my, another hiker!" Martha exclaimed. "We don't get many visitors on this trail. Most folks stick to the main paths. Sit down, dear, you look exhausted." Marcus tried to speak, tried to tell her they'd met before, but his voice wouldn't work. His legs carried him up the porch steps, and he found himself settling into the chair beside her. "I'm a bit lost, actually," he heard himself say. "I was on the Appalachian Trail and somehow ended up here. Do you know how I can get back?" Martha's smile never wavered. "Oh, you'll find your way, dear. Everyone does, eventually. But why don't you rest here tonight? It gets dangerous hiking these woods after dark." As exhaustion overwhelmed him, Marcus's last coherent thought was a terrible realization: he was making progress. Just not the kind he'd thought. With each house, each night, each kind host, he was walking further and further away from himself, until eventually there would be nothing left but an empty pair of hiking boots in someone's flower garden and another entry in Susan's journal. The trail continued east, and Marcus was making perfect progress toward a destination he would never remember wanting to reach. The weather report had been wrong. Dead wrong. Instead of the clear skies promised for her solo trek through Glacier National Park, Emma found herself hiking through an increasingly violent storm. The wind howled down from the peaks, driving sheets of rain horizontal across the exposed ridgeline. She'd been planning this trip for months, a 5-day backpacking circuit through some of the most remote wilderness in Montana. Emma was an experienced hiker, comfortable with solitude and prepared for harsh conditions. But this storm was beyond anything she anticipated. By the time she realized how bad it was going to get, Emma was too far from the trailhead to turn back. Her only option was to push forward to the emergency shelter marked on her map, still 3 miles ahead through increasingly treacherous terrain. The trail became harder to follow as the storm intensified. Rain had turned the path into a slippery mess of mud and loose rocks. Twice Emma nearly lost her footing on steep sections that would have sent her tumbling down the mountainside. She pulled out her headlamp even though it was still afternoon. The storm clouds had turned the sky so dark it felt like twilight. That's when she first saw the eyes. They appeared in her peripheral vision, just beyond the range of her headlamp beam. 2 points of reflected light, watching from the shadows between the trees. When Emma turned to look directly at them, they vanished. Mountain animals, she told herself. Deer, or maybe a coyote taking shelter from the storm. Nothing to worry about. But as she continued hiking, the eyes kept appearing. Always in pairs, always just outside the circle of light, always disappearing the moment she tried to focus on them. After an hour of this, Emma began to feel genuinely unnerved. The eyes seemed to be following her, maintaining a constant distance as she climbed higher into the mountains. Sometimes she glimpsed movement in her peripheral vision, shapes that seemed too large to be natural wildlife, moving with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. The storm grew worse. Wind gusts nearly knocked Emma off her feet, and the rain was coming down so hard she could barely see 10 feet ahead. She was soaked through despite her rain gear, and hypothermia was becoming a real concern. She had to find shelter soon. When Emma finally spotted the emergency hut through the storm, she nearly cried with relief. It was a small stone building built into the side of the mountain, designed to provide basic shelter for hikers caught in dangerous weather. She stumbled up to the heavy wooden door and pushed inside. The hut was larger than it appeared from outside, with stone walls thick enough to muffle the worst of the storm. A fireplace dominated one wall, and Emma was thrilled to find a supply of dry wood stacked nearby. Soon she had a crackling fire going, and the warmth began to drive the chill from her bones. As she changed into dry clothes and prepared a hot meal, Emma began to relax for the first time in hours. The hut was cozy and secure, and she had enough supplies to wait out the storm. She even found a logbook where previous visitors had recorded their stays. The entries painted a picture of the hut as a welcome refuge for hikers and climbers over the decades. But as Emma read through the more recent entries, her sense of security began to fade. Several hikers mentioned seeing strange lights on the peaks during storms. Others wrote about feeling watched while staying in the hut. Most unsettling was an entry from just 2 weeks earlier: "Something's out there. Can hear it moving around the hut at night. Won't stop scratching at the walls." Emma closed the logbook and tried to focus on more practical matters. She prepared her sleeping bag near the fireplace and organized her gear for the next day's hike. But as darkness fell outside, she became increasingly aware of sounds that didn't seem to belong to the storm. First came the scratching. Soft at first, like branches scraping against the stone walls, but gradually growing louder and more deliberate. Then she heard what sounded like footsteps on the hut's roof, heavy, measured steps that circled the building again and again. Emma told herself it was just the storm playing tricks with the acoustics, but when she peered out the small window, she saw them again, those reflected eyes, dozens of pairs now, forming a loose circle around the hut. They swayed slightly, as if attached to bodies that rocked back and forth in the wind. The scratching intensified, becoming a steady scraping sound that seemed to come from all directions. Emma grabbed her flashlight and checked the door's heavy bolt, making sure it was secure. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence more unsettling than the noise had been. Then came the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible above the storm. But gradually they grew louder, until Emma could make out individual words. The voices seemed to be coming from just outside the walls, speaking in perfect unison. "Let us in. So cold out here. Let us in." Emma's blood turned to ice. The voices were human, but there was something wrong with them, a hollow, echoing quality that made them sound like they were coming from a great distance, or from underground. "Please," the voices continued. "We're lost. Been walking for so long. Just need to get warm." Despite her terror, Emma found herself approaching the door. The voices sounded so desperate, so human. What if someone really was out there, caught in the storm? What if she was condemning innocent hikers to death by not opening the door? Her hand was on the bolt when she noticed something that stopped her cold. In the firelight, she could see that the door was old and weathered, but there was something carved into the wood near the handle. Letters, scratched deep into the grain: "Don't listen. Don't open. They're not human." The voices outside grew more insistent. "Please. We can see your light. We know you're in there. Why won't you help us?" Emma backed away from the door, her heart pounding. As she watched in horror, the heavy wooden barrier began to shake in its frame. Something was pushing against it from outside, testing its strength. That's when she noticed the eyes in the window. They were pressed against the glass, dozens of them, staring in at her with an intelligence that was definitely not animal. As Emma watched, paralyzed with fear, she realized the eyes weren't reflecting her flashlight beam, they were glowing with their own inner light. The voices changed, becoming angry. "We know you're in there. You can't hide forever. We've been waiting so long, and we're so hungry." The scratching resumed with renewed intensity. Emma could hear claws, they had to be claws, gouging deep furrows in the stone walls. The sound made her teeth ache. Whatever was out there was trying to dig its way in. Emma retreated to the far corner of the hut, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and in those shadows, she began to see shapes that didn't belong. Tall, elongated forms that seemed to be reaching toward her through the stone itself. The assault on the hut continued through the night. The scratching never stopped, sometimes accompanied by sounds like bones breaking or metal grinding against stone. The voices kept calling to her, alternating between pleas for help and threats of what they would do when they got inside. But worst of all were the moments of silence. During those stretches, Emma could feel them watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to let her guard down for just a moment. As dawn approached, the storm began to weaken. The scratching grew less intense, the voices faded to whispers. Emma dared to hope that whatever was out there might retreat with the darkness. She was wrong. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the window, Emma saw them clearly for the first time. They surrounded the hut completely, dozens of tall, impossibly thin figures with elongated limbs and faces that were almost human but wrong in every detail. Their skin was the color of old bone, and their eyes glowed with that same internal light she'd been seeing all night. They stood perfectly still, watching the hut, waiting. Emma realized with growing horror that they weren't leaving. They were just changing tactics. One of the creatures stepped forward and spoke in a voice that was almost normal, almost human. "The storm's passing. You'll have to come out eventually. And when you do, we'll be here. We're very patient. We've been waiting on these peaks for a very long time." Emma looked at the logbook again, reading the entries with new understanding. The hut wasn't a refuge, it was a trap. How many hikers had taken shelter here over the years, only to find themselves surrounded by watchers who never left, never slept, never stopped waiting? She thought about the emergency radio in her pack, but knew no rescue could reach her in time. The creatures were right, she would have to come out eventually. She had limited food and water, and the fire wouldn't last forever. As Emma settled in to wait, she opened the logbook to a fresh page and began to write, Day 1. They're still out there. I can see them through the window, just standing and watching. I think they might have been here all along, waiting in the peaks, watching everyone who passes through these mountains. The hut isn't protection, it's bait. If anyone finds this, don't come here alone. Don't trust the weather reports. And whatever you do, don't look directly into their eyes. I think that's how they call you outside. She paused, listening to the absolute silence beyond the walls. Even the wind had stopped. Through the window, she could see the creatures maintaining their vigil, motionless as statues but unmistakably alive. Emma turned to a fresh page and continued writing, Day 2. Still here. Still watching. I'm starting to understand why they wait. It's not about patience, it's about hunger. They feed on something more than flesh. They feed on hope, on the slow realization that rescue isn't coming, on the moment when you finally understand that the only choice left is to open the door and walk outside. The pen trembled in her hand as she added her final entry, Day 3. I can hear them whispering my name now. How do they know my name? The fire's almost out, and I'm down to my last bottle of water. I keep thinking about the door. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe they're telling the truth about being cold and lost. Maybe if I just opened it a crack. Emma closed the logbook and looked toward the door. In the dying firelight, she could swear she saw the bolt slowly beginning to turn.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.